Greetings. I'm typically not in the habit of posting long-form content, super long-form content in particular, especially when there's no certainty in terms of the payoff and cost in the long run, but I feel that this topic is a special case. Before we begin, I'd first like to offer my humble obeisances to Sri Dharma Pravartika Acharya, the Vedic guru who assisted me with the research that went into this video and in this dissertation, and whose insights over the years have impacted me profoundly and have consistently proven to be of invaluable use to both me and my own work. You may all feel free to give his own channel, Dharma Nation, a sub. It made me look into the Vedic texts to a serious capacity, among them the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, and the Vedas, to get a greater grasp of Iranic civilization, both pre-Islam and post-Islam, and learn to reject fallacious forms of thinking, such as syncretism, such as radical universalism, such as New Ageism, such as blind faith, and free myself from the media matrix, among other things. The folks in Iranian nationalist circles drone on and on about how we want to return to the glory days of our ancient empires, to the glory days of our once venerated Aryan civilization, to our origins, in spite of the incredibly scant knowledge on what they actually even were. A similar issue exists in relation to the Kurds and their quest to embrace their own traditions. I assure you that the information I'm going to disseminate in this video, in this dissertation, is only known to a handful of people in both communities, and is also but the tip of the iceberg. In addition to Acharya Chi's channel, I would also heavily suggest giving the interviews he's done with Thomas Rousel, aka Survive the Jive, with Alex Jones, and with Leonenda Eld Englisk, among others, a listen, because it's worth the time, and also to check out his hitherto published books, starting with Principles of Perfect Leadership. Without further ado, let us proceed to my talk. Namaste, everyone. I've spoken about the Yazidis before and how their path is also an offshoot of Sanatana Dharma, but that this has only been the case recently. Now I'm going to elaborate a bit more on their Vedic connections, but before I dive into that, before we look into their religion, I'd like to talk about this topic in depth, not just with the Yazidis, but with several Near Eastern religions actually. First of all, going back to truly the very beginning of recorded history, of course we know that previous to Abrahamism, and in the case of the Middle East, that especially means Islam, you could talk about Judaism too, but Judaism previous to the Roman Empire was pretty tiny. It was basically just the Levant area, but then when you have Islam, of course, that covered most of the Middle East, but previous to that, indeed, people were following offshoots of Sanatana Dharma. Not even offshoots, actually. We couldn't even say that. They were following Sanatana Dharma imperfectly. And that is not to take anything away from these people. We can say the same thing about the ancient Europeans of the same time period, etc. That they were certainly trying to follow Sanatana Dharma through memory, and as a result, a lot of it became localized, a lot of it became very parochial. That is the case for the ancient Greco-Roman religion and so many of these religions, and this was the case also in the Middle East. If you go back pre-Islam especially, much of the Middle East, actually you would have to say pre-Christian as well, because to give the full history, the Middle East first was following Dharma. Then with the arising of Christianity, a lot of people are not aware of this. Much of the Middle East became Christian, so that includes Syria, that includes large parts of Iraq, that includes Lebanon, that includes North Africa, etc. And then Islam came in. In fact, Christianity's earliest outposts and strongholds happened to be located in the Middle East and North Africa. If you take a look at a map of the globe, this makes perfect sense. Palestine is closer to Persia than it is to France, after all. But previous to all of this, indeed, you had many varied peoples who were following Sanatana Dharma in accordance with their own specific tribal understanding of it. So what does that mean? That means that the names of the gods would have been different, that some of the practices would have been different, the languages used would have been different, their natural terrain would have been different, one being a lot of desert, another one being areas that would have had more forests and so on. That all makes a difference as well, but they were following Sanatana Dharma. With the arising specifically of Islam, what we see is that today we only have a small number of groups that still exist in the Middle East that are still kind of following Sanatana Dharma to the best of their ability, meaning considering the fact that, of course, they've been persecuted beyond words, and not just recently, but ever since Islam took over in the Middle East, the Near East. They were persecuted. That, plus, of course, with time, it's just a natural thing. As more time goes on, people tend to forget what's the authentic and pure practice, etc. But now, speaking about the 21st century, you still have several groups in the Middle East and the Islamic world in general who really are following Dharma. You have the Yazidis, you have the Druze, for example, in Lebanon and parts of Syria and Palestine. You have the Kalash in present-day Pakistan. There's the Alawite sect in Syria. That is a minority religion, but that, interestingly, the ruling Assad family regime there follows. And you also have the Mandaeans, who are a relic of the Gnostics. There are many of these groups where they're not quite Islamic. They're very ancient, but if you look at them, you can see that they were unfortunately altered by Islam, but they're not Islamic. So the Yazidis are one of these groups. Now, when you look at the Yazidis, they had one primary temple, not many of them, but they had one primary temple. That temple, sadly, was destroyed by ISIS several years ago, but they believe in Murti worship, what our Muslim friends would call idol worship. Their cosmology is something very similar to the Vedic cosmology. These are individuals who believe in reincarnation. They have their own scriptures. They have their own caste system, their own varnas. They will say outright, and they always have, even at the risk of persecution and getting unalived, in front of their staunch and avid, fanatically Sunni peers, that they're not Muslims, etc. And what is interesting is that, again, due to just the geographic distance and the distance of time and history, previously these people would not have necessarily described themselves as followers of Sanatana Dharma, because most likely 100, 200, 500 years ago, they would have not even heard of that term. They would not have even heard of this Sanskrit term, because neither Yazidis nor Kurds have ever spoken Sanskrit. The ethnicities of their region all largely came into being in the Kali Yuga. But what's interesting is that now, post-ISIS, many of the leaders of the Yazidis consider their religion to be a part of Sanatana Dharma. They literally use that term. It was very nice that when the persecution of these people was still happening, tremendous help came from the Indian Hindu community in particular, and this is a little part of the recent history that people are not aware of when it comes to the Yazidis, and many of these people ended up in diaspora communities in America, some in India, many different places in Europe, because they had to. They were being literally murdered, and what's interesting is that the people who reached out to them the most were Indian Hindus, and without preaching, because Indian Hindus don't do that, because That's a nefarious and duplicitous sort of behavior that the Christians of the British Empire were known for doing in Africa, namely freeing slaves from bondage with the lowly ulterior motive of trying to convert them slowly afterwards. What ended up happening was, as the Indian Hindus in all these countries helped the Yazidi refugees more and more, and the Yazidis began to explore Hinduism. They basically began to recognize the parallels. My lord, this is all what we believe too. How do you guys know what is in our secret books that no one other than us is allowed to see? How do you know our worldview and philosophy? How is this possible? Are we some lost tribe of Aryavarta or something? Are we actually just crypto-Hindus? So what's interesting is that now in many Yazidi communities, they consider themselves to be what we would say, and that is kind of an offshoot or watered down version of Sanatana Dharma, to the point where you find them knocking off Vedic organizations now. For example, there's this page on Facebook, for instance, called the Yazidi Sanatana Dharma Society. That's a knockoff of this other group that I follow obsessively, the ISDS, based in Omaha. These are Yazidis who understand that they follow Sanatana Dharma. So yes, it's a very interesting thing. You basically find parallels throughout the world. You find peoples who unfortunately have been under Islamic rule, but they themselves have retained their Vedic, or let's say Dharmic, culture for many thousands of years. That's certainly the case, God knows, in Indonesia and Malaysia and places like this. So now that I've gone through the introduction, I'd like to pivot this talk somewhere else. A lot of you may have never heard of this Vedic connection between the Yazidis and Sanatana Dharma before. You may have heard more of a connection with the Yazidis with Zoroastrianism as opposed to Sanatana Dharma, or simply that it's just the original and indigenous faith of the Kurdish people and of Kurdistan. I will address both of these claims right now. First and foremost, neither of them are untrue. They are both correct, because here's what you have to take into consideration. Given the thousands of years that have gone by, the Yazidis, like all of these groups, have necessarily been influenced by the predominant cultures that are around them. This being the case, back when Zoroastrianism was a more powerful force pre-Islam, previous to the Muslim hordes taking over Iran Shah, certainly they were influenced by them as well, in the same way as they were influenced later a little bit by Muslims. But this begs the question, of course, about the Zoroastrian connection to all of this as well, which I will delve into right now. Just like the Yazidis, the Zoroastrians themselves are also an offshoot of Sanatana Dharma, and in their case we can actually use this term, offshoot. Zarathustra himself was a Vedic priest who went rogue. He was an individual who was not a hero. He was an individual who, at the time that he was alive, lived in a completely Vedic milieu. Persia was following actual Sanatana Dharma, an actual Vedic religion, to the point of doing yagyas, to the point of following the Vedas, to the point of worshipping Vedic deities, among them Mitra, etc. Zarathustra created several so-called reforms that really turned everything upside down and rejected much of the core values of Sanatana Dharma. And as far as his teachings, as I've also said before, very little about them is actually known to any clearly ascertainable capacity, because any and all information about both them and Zoroastrian theology as a whole come from sources from the Avestan literary tradition that are not contemporaneous with his lifetime, or even a couple of centuries after his lifetime. We have the thickest fog surrounding any and all details about Zarathustra, who he was, where he lived, when he lived, what his opinions on XYZ are, the same way an Aristotle or a Plato or another system builder from the ancient world would have illustrated them, namely in writing. We do know that his teachings were Dharmic, at least at a bare bones minimum level, and that these disruptive reforms that are attributed to him did occur. So Zoroastrianism is a very interesting case, but this begs the question that even the Zoroastrians themselves, of course, are an offshoot of Sanatana Dharma. So yes, there certainly was some influence on many of the peoples of the Near East, including even Gnostics, including certainly the Manichaeans as well, which was always kind of a concocted thing. It was never something traditional or authentic. But yes, when Zoroastrianism was still a predominant religion in the area, it influenced many people. That's just a natural occurrence. But truthfully, as far as the Yazidis themselves, their own scholars, their own religious leaders themselves have looked into this as well, and they themselves relate more to Sanatana Dharma and to Christianity, Eastern Christianity even, both Nestorian and Jacobite, than Zoroastrianism or the Kurdish Muslim culture. And that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. What do their leaders say? What do their leaders say? Their leaders acknowledge that Zoroastrianism had a little bit of an effect on them, but they relate more to Sanatana Dharma and also to Assyrians. Since we're already smack dab in the middle of a conversation about the Kurds, I'd like now to pivot over to a topic that's not just about them specifically, but rather all the ethnic groups around the world that have a history that's tied to Sufi orders and sects, such as the Tajiks, such as the Pashtuns, such as the Turkmens, such as the Albanians, such as the Yugoslavs, and others. Because Sufi tariqas and Sufi-like religious demographics, of which there are several that are still active in this day and age, such as the Alevis, such as the Yarsanists, such as the Naqshbandis, which the Barzani family of Kurdistan has roots in, such as the Bektashis, who are active in the Balkans and Turkey now, but who originated from Eastern Anatolia, such as the Mevlevis, such as the Qadariya, and others, have been significantly influenced by Vedantic teachings, Vedantic being a synonym for Vedic and Dharmic. I'm about to delve into some delicate territory here, but when it comes to the Sufis and Sufi-like demographics, this is a very controversial topic, not so much in Kurdistan or in Iran or in Turkey, but in India more than anywhere else, because of the fact that, on the one hand, if one looks at the development of Sufism in a very objective sort of way, it is indeed the case that they got many of their teachings also from Sanatana Dharma. They also got many of their teachings indeed directly from Vedanta, including many of their practices as well, many of their meditational practices, etc. on the one hand. This is indeed true on the one hand. On the other hand, when you read someone like David Frawley, this Hindutva author, who wrote somewhat extensively about the relationships of the Sufis vis-a-vis forced conversions of Hindus to Islam, and also someone like Imran Khan, who's written somewhat extensively about Sufis on the opposite side of the spectrum, effectively whitewashing them, you get all sorts of different perspectives and problematic opinions and takes about them that don't complement one another. But basically, it's a very interesting history that the Sufis have, but it's also a very dark history that even the Sufis have, unfortunately, specifically in North India. For instance, there was this one mystic called Al-Sirhindi who called for the forced subjugation of all non-Muslims. In other places across the globe, it's a different story with them. In Egypt, in Turkey, in Persia, in the Balkans, Sufi history in those places is nowhere near as dark as it is in North India. Too many of them there really genuinely and fanatically despised Sanatana Dharmis, fanatically despised Zoroastrians fanatically despised Christians and pretty much all non-Muslims and wanted them all gone. Perhaps maybe in Kurdistan, Sufi history is just as dark because the Sufi Kurds there despised the Yazidis a lot and either collaborated with or received tacit support from the Ottomans, and not even forcefully converting them, but just outright exterminating them for being enemy unbelievers. The Sunni Kurds adhere to Shafite jurisprudence for the most part, and according to that, even Zoroastrians get a pass as people of the book, but Yazidis were not, and thus had to go through way more instances of persecution, discrimination, and genocidal religious cleansing than the residual Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian populations in their regions did because of that. I only say this because we have to call a spade a spade. When you look specifically at the Ottoman Empire, the Kurds are often used as shock troops against all the infidel communities in eastern Anatolia, in Mesopotamia, in Syria, and even inside Iran and Persia. This is why you're going to come across a lot of Yazidis who want nothing to do with the Kurdish community, who do not identify as Kurdish at all, despite Kurmanji being the one and only relevant language of their faith, and who even actively curse and insult them and ally with Assyrians against them. A lot of Assyrians who dislike Kurds intensely and have nothing good to say about them. A lot of Armenians who dislike Kurds intensely and have nothing good to say about them. A lot of Turks who dislike Kurds intensely and have nothing good to say about them, albeit for completely different reasons. And with all of these people, we have to be patient with them because one has to understand the context. And as far as India, the Sufis have an absolutely sinister history there that, as far as the right-wing Hindu establishment is concerned, overshadows any positive legacy and any positive contributions they've had in the subcontinent. When you look specifically at India, the Sufis were often used as shock troops against the Vedic communities there. So as a result, for many individuals who follow Sanatana Dharma, they really don't see too much of a practical difference between so-called mystical Sufism on the one hand versus just outright jihad on the other. So even when it comes to many Hindu leaders in India today, they also have nothing good to say about Sufis because they've served a very dark role. Sufism's chances of ever being rehabilitated there, let alone Islam in general, are virtually slim to none. Hence the backstory of Hindu-Muslim tensions that culminated in partition. Probably the most controversial Persian writer of the 20th century, the Azerbaijani nationalist's worst nightmare, Ahmad Kasravi, also had nothing good to say about the Sufis either, albeit for reasons which I will not get into here since they're beyond the scope of this talk. But again, looking at this very objectively, historically, and from a purely philosophical perspective of religious history, indeed, many Sufis were directly influenced by not just Vedanta, but also yogic techniques as well. That is definitely the case, and for that matter, since the Assyrians and Eastern Christians are in the equation in all of this, you could say the same thing about the very early Orthodox Christian monks too, many of whom practiced forms of pranayama, certainly mantra meditation in a way, in that they would recite various prayers but do it in mantric form, etc. And I don't mean the contemporary Orthodox, I mean the Paleo-Orthodox Christian monks who would have been active in the original strongholds and outposts of Christianity in Palestine and Syria and Asia Minor and Egypt and Mesopotamia and the like. It's arguable that Sanatana Dharma, from a mystical perspective, had influence on all of these mystical strains that you see even within the Abrahamic religions. Again, this is controversial because on the one hand, we need to recognize these influences. On the other hand, we also need to be a little bit careful to not become radical universalists as a result. i.e., believers in the false notion that all religions are the same, all religions are correct and equally valid, and ultimately lead us to the same destination, that you're a Vaishnava Hindu plus a Mazda Zoroastrian plus Orthodox, old school Orthodox, plus some type of Sufi, etc., because that's not true at all, with all due respect to Pope Francis and the Dalai Lama. Despite all of this doesn't mean that Sufis or the Eastern Orthodox are intrinsically or necessarily all Dharmic. We're still supposed to think of both of them as fundamentally Abrahamic in worldview. We don't go to Sufi lodges. We don't convert to their sects. We don't have extensive contact with their communities and so on. We don't go to Orthodox churches to worship there. People are going to be hostile and unfriendly towards us and our takes on their faith. We can go in them to offer our humble obeisance towards the statues, paintings, and other artistic devices of Jesus that would be inside of them, but we do not go to church as a true Christian would, or have crucifixes in our homes or in our offices. We do not convert to Orthodoxy or get baptized, although I will admit that a pagan and Orthodoxy pipeline is absolutely real, but this is something very important to keep in mind, and more than anything, the differentiation that we need to make when it comes to these mystical streams within the Abrahamic religions is more than anything not just the historical factors. This group took from this group took this from this. It's more, what is the nature of the being who they are worshiping? The prime example that I'm known to speak about more, only because I'm in a Christian country and have been in a Christian country for practically my whole life thus far, and because the bulk of the people that I want to have association with moving forward are largely former Christians, former Muslims, and I'm just going to call them truly Orthodox, is Christianity. Christianity is ontologically a mixed bag in that you have a tremendous Abrahamic influence that's there. Indeed, the majority of it is Abrahamic structurally, theologically, in practice, etc. As far as mentality, it's very Abrahamic. On the other hand, you do have, again, that minority little tendency there towards mysticism. And what's interesting is, I don't know if I've ever made this as clear as I'm going to right now. What is really the difference is not just the exterior. Oh, these Christian mystics seem to be doing something that looks Vedic. That's merely the facade. It's actually deeper than that. It's a matter of who they are actually worshipping. While it's true that the majority of Christians, including the Eastern ones, like the Assyrians, the Copts, and the Armenians, are worshipping the God of the Old Testament, the same God as in the Quran, Yahweh, Allah, whichever name you wish to use. While it's true that the majority of Christians are unknowingly worshipping this being, many of these so-called mystics within Christianity are not. They are worshipping the God of Jesus, and the God of Jesus was not Yahweh. So this is what is of importance. The same thing could be said even in Islam with the aforementioned Sufi mystics in mind. We just shouldn't talk about this a lot because it's a confusing topic for people, and it confuses people about their traditions. We don't want people to become radical universalists. But this is the underlying question. Is it indeed possible to have individuals who are very sincere, who truly want to have devotion towards that which is the supreme, that they discover practices that are Vedic, that are yogic, etc., and that their hearts can melt in love for the true God? Of course it's a possibility. That's the nature of grace. If we were to say that that weren't a possibility, well then what are we saying about the nature of God? That God doesn't have that ability for grace. So of course, there have always been a minority of individuals, even in the Abrahamic religions, who are on the right path and that have always been on the right path. But the reason why is due to who they are worshiping. Are they worshiping truly a being in which nothing can be conceived that is greater than him, the supreme absolute? Or are they worshiping an evil desert divinity? That is the subtlest of questions, the subtlest of things that is often hard to determine. Forget about the Dharmic, Abrahamic dichotomy in this case, for this is the bottom line, the ultimate litmus test theologically. But getting back to Christianity as an example, if you meet an individual who calls himself a Christian, but who is not tied to any denomination, and who boils his faith down to following in the footsteps of Jesus, and being Jesus-like, being loving, being compassionate, being giving, and praying to God and the like as purely as they can, instead of focusing on creeds and covenants and theology so much, that person is not worshiping the Abrahamic God despite calling themselves a Christian. How do we determine one versus the other? Well, by the fruits. And that's a subtle thing. You can tell that someone is an Abrahamist by how hard, how mean, and how doctrinaire-oriented they are. Someone can belong to an Abrahamic religion, but aspire to know surely who God is. And when you meet them, it's like meeting a fellow Vaishnava, even if they've never heard that term in their life. If you were to go up to such a person and tell them that, judging by their behavior, they are truly with God, that they are truly a Vaishnava, they'd say, thanks, what's a Vaishnava? So they wouldn't recognize the term, but they would be acting like a Vaishnava nonetheless. So indeed, we need to be open to that minority of individuals who find themselves in an Abrahamist culture and milieu, because what are they to do if they find themselves, say, in northern Germany in 1285, and all that there is Christianity, but they really want to know God? That person becomes what is often called in the West, in academia, a mystic. When you read about all of your Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scientists, philosophers, and theologians, bear in mind that they're all products of their milieu. If they had been born in a different lifetime and in different milieus, maybe they would have followed the Dharmic path, Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Hellenist, or something else. The Islamic Golden Age philosophers and scientists most certainly would not have been Muslims. And the last thing I'll say about this is, how do we know that there's a big difference between Abrahamism versus those individuals within Abrahamism who actually are on the right track? How do we know that this distinction is really there, among other ways? Well, sadly, the Abrahamic institution tends to kill such people. They tend to persecute such people. They tend to call such people who are really living, like real yogis, even though they are in an Islamic society, a Christian society, and so on. They will persecute such people. So, how many people have been killed? Quite possibly the greatest Catholic mystic of all time, St. Francis of Assisi, came close to being killed. So how many of these people were persecuted by their own Abrahamic religions? That's how we see the distinction, in the same way that this was true for Jesus. People like David Wood and Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, and Adam Green of No More News, and Varg Vikernes, who wanted to drone on and on about how Jesus was just a Jew, a rabbi, he was just fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies. Nonsense. All the representatives of Abrahamism around him, surrounding him, hated him. They couldn't understand him. They thought he was a heretic. They thought that he was dealing with demonic spirits, and they ultimately killed him. One last thing I'm going to touch upon before I call this a video. I've said that Zoroastrianism is a Dharmic faith, and several of you have asked me how this is the case when they literally worship an Asura, Ahura Mazda. How do the Zoroastrians who worship an Asura, but supposedly follow a Dharmic path, fit into this? Well, this is a conundrum that those who have had the eyes to even see what Zoroastrianism really is, and that it's a Dharmic path, this is something that has indeed been confusing for people. So I'll try to explain this in a small nutshell, since this dissertation is already long enough as it is. Interestingly, again, just to recap, previous to Zarathustra, it was indeed the case that we Iranics were following truly Sanatana Dharma, not an offshoot, not our own version of it. We were following the Vedas. Mitra as a deity is literally from the Vedas. This is the definition of an individual who is Vedika, who is a Vedic follower, who is a follower of Sanatana Dharma, and also of who is Arya or an Aryan. Do you follow the Vedas? And indeed we were. We indeed were. It was only later that this began to be altered, but originally we were following the same Vedas as were the peoples of ancient India and other places on the globe at the time. What happened was an inversion of the two main Vedic pantheons. You see, there are several pantheons, but the two biggest of which are the Devas and the Asuras. It was always recognized, indeed, in the Bhagavad Gita and in so many other places. There are so many derivative words that come from the Sanskrit Deva. I do have viewers from the former Soviet Union here. I'm not sure if there are any Lithuanian speakers among them who can confirm this, but in Lithuanian, I believe it's the same word. They just add an A to it or something like that. I have working proficiency in multiple foreign languages, but Lithuanian is one of them. But indeed, they also call their gods Devas. You find this everywhere. It was the understanding that the Devas are good and that the Asuras are bad, but at the same time, they are considered to be two pantheons. In other words, there are some Asuras who are good. It's not clear-cut, so you can't write off Ahura Mazda as a demon in the Hindu context right off the bat. Quite the opposite. These pantheons were both recognized, but it came to the point where indeed, the Asuras became more and more evil. They began to get further and further away from pure Dharma. At the same time, interestingly, for those Asuras who are truly leaders in their community and powerful Asuras, they actually do try to follow Dharma to some extent. Even evil beings, even bad beings, even dangerous beings, if they're noble enough, if they actually do try to follow Dharma to some extent, then they're good. This is true for the Nagas, this is true for the Asuras, etc. All that is an aside. What Zarathustra ended up doing, of course, was that he reversed things. The Asuras are now good, and the Devas are now bad. And as soon as he did this, of course, from an ontological perspective and from a worship perspective, this became something radically different from Sanatana Dharma, and this is basically the line in the sand that Zoroastrianism draws. Interestingly, however, when it came to behavioral practices, behavioral norms, ethics, etc., Zoroastrianism, including Zarathustra himself, continued to fully uphold the Dharmic norm. So we still remained Dharmic even after his reforms. What they switched is who we worshipped, and we also simplified things quite a bit. So rather than all of the many devas and divinities of Sanatana Dharma, we narrowed it down a bit. People are not aware of this, but Zoroastrianism is, on the one hand, a monotheistic religion. On the other hand, even under Zarathustra, they still continue to worship quite a few of the Vedic divinities as Yazidis. It's not proto-Abrahamic in any way. We just made our pantheon smaller. We were monotheistic back then in that it was Ahura Mazda who became the supreme being for us. But the point is this: as far as who we worshipped, our prophet Zarathustra began to flip that upside down, and we began to worship the Asuras. But as far as our values, the values were still Dharmic. As strange as this may seem, that is indeed what happened historically, and that is why our Mejusi forebears can still kind of be classified in the category of Dharmis. But at the same time, with this understanding that as far as who they were worshipping and what they were doing spiritually and metaphysically, it was a reversal of actual Sanatana Dharma. Hence why there are no murtis, no statues in a Mejusi home, because Herodotus, in his writings about us, did claim that idol worship was something that we were opposed to after that point. So this being the case, it became an offshoot. It was the first offshoot of pure Sanatana Dharma, of which there were several. There was Zoroastrianism, there was Jainism, there was Buddhism eventually, and Sikhism is the latest one. These are all actual offshoots, because the founders of all of these religions, or let's say the religion as practiced originally, was Sanatana Dharma. The same thing happened with us. Zarathustra made an offshoot faith out of Sanatana Dharma. Jainism, the founder of that, quote unquote, what they call the founder, in this context, we don't recognize him as a founder, is Rishabhadeva, who is a Vedic Chakravartin and accepted as such in Sanatana Dharma. They were a part of Sanatana Dharma just like we were, and then eventually, soon after Mahavira passed away, they became an offshoot. As far as Buddhism, Buddha never denounced or renounced Sanatana Dharma. On the contrary, he uses the term in his teachings, actually. Sanatana Dharma. Most of you have heard of the term Dharma through Buddhism, if you've even heard of it at all before. If you look at the Dhammapada, he talks about the qualities of a true Brahmana. Individuals who later claim that he rejected the so-called caste system, he did no such thing. He accepted Varna. In the Dhammapada, he has many aphorisms where he even speaks about what a true Brahmana is. But then, beginning approximately around the time of Ashoka, in between Ashoka and Nagarjuna, it became an offshoot too. They were no longer part of Sanatana Dharma. The same thing with Sikhism. People are not aware of this, but Guru Nanak was the founder of Sikhism. He was a Vaishnava. He wasn't just quote-unquote Hindu. He was a practicing Vaishnava. Today, people who know Sikhism know that they are opposed to Murti worship, what our Muslim friends call idols. Well, he worshipped idols. He went to Jagannath Puri. He offered his obeisances to Lord Jagannath. He worshipped Murtis. He meditated specifically on the name Govinda. That was his mantra. He was a Vaishnava. He was a Vaishnava in every way. Other Vaishnavas at the time, including Vallabha, including Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even recognized Nanak as one. It was approximately 200 years after him that Gobind Singh, the 10th Guru, I believe he was, made Sikhism into then something separate. So indeed, these are all offshoots of Sanatana Dharma. But then when we talk about getting more into cultural expressions, like the Yazidis, like the Druze, like the Greco-Romans, these weren't so much offshoots. They were derivatives. In other words, they were doing their best to follow something sincerely, but too much time had elapsed and too much geographical distance had been crystallized to the point where that, plus the accretion of localized cultural norms, such as changed words, more stories about the gods suddenly appearing, etc., all of that came into the picture. These guys aren't offshoots per se, but rather local flavors of Sanatana Dharma, so we have to recognize this distinction between the two. And with all of that, this is where I end my dissertation. Thank you so much for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you found this video, this dissertation, of value.